Sequestration. I'd love to stand up here and say we fought the good fight and we've won, except I can't. We're fighting the fight, and I got to tell you, we're taking some sucking chest wounds here in our country over this. Sequestration has been applied. We sort of lost that battle, I guess you could say, to try and keep it staved off, at least as far as it applies to defense. And frankly, it's it's tough. We're applying a year's worth of cuts under sequestration in 6 months. And it would have been tough to do it over a year. Trying to do it over 6 months when you've already been spending money at the other rate for 6 months makes it very, very difficult and painful. The rest of the government, looking at it writ large, has done some interesting stuff. They've gotten some buys, depending on congressional action. You know, the FAA got a buy for the air traffic controllers. There's some others that are out there floating around, have not been approved yet. Some of them have been distinctly theatrical, things like closing the White House tours, and then about a day later flying a bunch of people around in helicopters to look at the cherry blossoms. I thought that was interesting. You know, the White House fleet helicopters taking people around on tours of the trees, as beautiful as they are. But I have to tell you, the DOD's they've been, as one would expect, you know, they're kind of pretty good at following orders. They started making the cuts and trying to apply it. Now remember, the personnel accounts are exempt. You know, all sorts of other parts are exempt. We've shortened the time. So it's all had the effect of concentrating those cuts on readiness-related factors. I won't go through all of them. You've seen a lot of them in the papers. It's difficult, and DOD is struggling right now. Now, let me begin by saying some of this is their own doing. You know, I spent my whole career in DOD, so you know, it's near and dear to my heart, but they're part of the problem. Before the election, you know, back in the summer and fall, when a lot of us were trying to raise this issue and beat the drum, there were a lot of leaders in the Pentagon, some of them in uniform, who said, "Oh, yeah, it's not going to be a problem. No, we're not even planning for it yet. It's never going to happen." Other than General Amos, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, who rather bravely stood up and said, "This is going to kill us if this happens. We're not going to be able to do what the Marine Corps has always promised it would be able to do if this happens." The other chiefs all sort of either rolled or were rolled, depending on how you want to look at it, and they said, no, it's not a big deal. Then suddenly in January, everybody started screaming like Chicken Little that the sky was going to fall. I think I've said this here before. The problem is the second set of responses were, while overly dramatic, were closer to the truth than the first, because there is going to be a negative effect on DOD. When you take half of the sequester cuts out of a part of the budget that's only 18–19% of the spending, and then crunch it up in time, it's really going to cause a problem, and it has. So I would hopefully encourage the DOD leadership, and I was at a meeting earlier this week over at DOD with a bunch of different think tank folks and some of their senior leadership. I don't know what the actual, you know, whether we're doing it on background or not, so I won't say who it was with, but they were, you know, significant players who were saying, what do we do? You know, how do we affect this? And the first thing all of us said, and there was all the way across the ideological spectrum, we all said, well, the first thing you need to do is allow the chiefs to say what they really think all the time, that you can't use those guys as political stalking horses, because once their credibility goes down, you've really hosed your ability to influence the process. Now, hopefully they heard us on that. Excuse me. But, you know, we've had things, you know, the Air Force has shut the hangar doors, as they say, on 13 fighter squadrons. They've made major cutbacks in naval deployments. They've extended the deployments of troops in Afghanistan and some of the other ships that are out running around, because they don't have the money for the transition piece, the train up for them, and then the actual handovers, which are frankly kind of pricey sometimes. That's a problem. That means you're leaving some of these kids out in harm's way for a longer period of time. that frankly is the most dangerous period of any combat deployment. You're not doing the quality of train up when those kids finally get to go to deploy, whether it is to Afghanistan or just to sea. That's dangerous. That gets people killed, and that's what they're looking at. There's a lot of other training cutbacks, schools, not necessarily. They solved the problem with the tuition assistance program, but there's a lot of actual military training that's going by the wayside. One that I know of, they do a reserve officer training out at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, for officers in the Guard and Reserve that do domestic response things. They have an annual set of training out there. Different people come out for about a week's worth of training to really get the cutting-edge stuff that Fort Leonard Wood as the center for chemical, biological, nuclear, radiological, all the other stuff, MPs and engineers. They're all together at Fort Leonard Wood, and they bring these folks out there to talk about domestic response. And they've canceled that training for this year. They're bringing the people, but they can't bring any of the people that were going to teach the classes. So instead, they're going to have the guy who does the administrative running of that course. He's got to teach the whole POI himself. Now, he's a pretty smart, capable guy, but he's really not qualified to do that. So that means those officers and men are going to get substandard training. So you're seeing that squeezing coming now as far as readiness. It isn't a fall off a cliff thing, but it's going to be a slow and steady erosion of the advantages that we have with our military. And I can tell you, I spent nearly 30 years in the Army in Special Forces, so I know what well-trained, well-equipped, high-speed, low-drag people are. And we have them. We have the best trained military we've ever had in the history of this country today. But they're tired. Their equipment is old. You don't keep that kind of edge without doing the training and upgrading the equipment and modernizing the equipment and at least doing maintenance on the equipment. And that's not happening right now. And it's just the beginning of that wave. Because right now, DOD is planning now under the assumption that sequestration is going to be the norm, not just this time and then it's over. And frankly, I think they're wise to plan that way. So for folks in the conservative movement that care about the common defense, we got to stay engaged. We can't give up on this and say, oh, well, it's done. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of people on the conservative side that are just as bad as anybody on the liberal side, and they're saying, well, they can accept some cuts if they just work a little harder, and that's a slow erosion and allowing everything to come up for grabs because there's a lot less of a constituency in the United States for military readiness than there is for all of the entitlement spending that we get on the domestic side. And our leadership here, particularly in this building, they've got to fight that fight, and they've got to make the tough choices. And it feels to them like it's less of a tough choice to try and bleed the Maasai cow of DOD rather than to turn to those domestic entitlements. And again, I've said this here too, I'm not saying that DOD could not get more efficient. It should and it must. But that money that is saved from any of that reorganization and tightening up needs to be plowed back into modernization, not siphoned off to go pay for something else. And right now, that's what we're looking at. And as I say, it's about as dismal a picture as I can paint, and I'm not trying that hard. It is a pretty dire thing. It isn't, the Republic's not going to fall next week. The military is not suddenly going to go into revolt. We still have the best guys and gals in the world, but it is not something that is just a foregone conclusion. If you don't make the investment, you don't pay the attention to it, that starts to erode. And I've said this before as well. I spent my whole career making sure that we never went anywhere into a fair fight. Fair fights stink. You always want to go in when you have a massive advantage. And we've had that everywhere we've gone Sometimes we make political decisions where we don't utilize all the ability we have, and that's a different set of problems. But we really, in this case, need to keep up the fight. So I would just encourage all of you, because a lot of the organizations here, you really care about this stuff. Don't give up and don't roll over, but continue to make the case that we've got to fix sequestration. We've got to get, it's a silly rule. Everybody knows it's silly. We should not sit back and accept it, and if we do, shame on us. And I got to tell you, that means something to me, because I may be Colonel retired Bucci, but there's a Captain Bucci floating around out there, and I want to make sure he stays equipped properly and trained properly with all the people around him, because I don't want to lose him because we decided we needed to have more Meals on Wheels and not protect this country. So I'll stop with that and take whatever questions you may have.
Steve, that's a very powerful concluding point, and kind of where I wanted to go in just opening this up. The FAA got relief because it engaged in what I guess is called in Washington the Washington Monument Syndrome. There are some who are skeptical of what is happening to the military right now, which you've alluded to as evidence of the same syndrome. Unfortunately, we won't necessarily see the inconvenience or the downsides associated with this until something really bad happens and all of that lack of training or lack of equipping or readiness kicks in. Would you just speak to this question as to whether or not the military could be doing other things to accept and absorb these cuts instead of the ones that they're taking now?
Yeah, the military, DOD, could be made more efficient. It's in large measure not in their hands to do the things that need to be done. It's in the hands of our legislators and the administration. Things like reforming the procurement and acquisition system. It is flat broken. It is designed to develop suboptimal solutions, not intentionally, but that's the result of it. It is slow, it's ponderous, it is unbelievably inefficient, and it stretches out all the procurement, so we waste a boatload of money, an aircraft carrier load of money. That needs to be fixed. DOD doesn't have an option as to how they do that. It's mandated to them in law and policy and regulation, all sorts of things that are out of their hands. That needs to be fixed. Now, there are some things they can do, but it's going to be painful for them too. Things like service-related redundancies in the department. The department, Secretary Hagel could tell the services, you're only going to have one medical system. You're not going to have an Army and the Navy and an Air Force medical system. The human body's the same, no matter what color uniform they wear. And you'll get all sorts of people who will pound the table and say, no, our needs are different. It's got, that's baloney. And that stuff should be blown away. And I'll tell you, in this meeting I had, our recommendation to those folks was all those kind of things, you need to act swiftly and quickly and just make them do it. And if somebody tries to get in the way, they should be fired. And for those people on the Hill, I hope you would not aid and abet those who would try and hinder those kind of efforts. But on the other hand, the real big money issues are not in the hands of the department. They are in the hands of the legislators who pass the laws. Now, I got to tell you something. I grew up in a hollow army. Right? I graduated from West Point in 1977. It was not a good time in the military. It wasn't the worst. The worst was just before I graduated, when the volunteer military was just kicking in. I mean, it was horrible. You could not go in the barracks in Europe as an officer at night without a gun, because you would get jumped by essentially gangs running the barracks, and they would mug officers. I mean, it was horrible. The drug use was rampant. It was terrible. We had a big military then, but it was essentially a big, flabby, out-of-shape, inadequate organization. We don't have that today. The hollow army today is going to be different. Or hollow military, sorry, I'm an Army guy, I tend to move in that direction. It's small, it's compact, it is unbelievably fit and capable, but it's small, and it's going to end up getting smaller. And while we'll still be able to deal with most of the issues that come up, even with that smaller force, but when the next big thing comes down the road, it's a lot harder to transform that small tough guy into a big tough guy than it is to take that big flabby guy and get him in shape. And that's the best way I can put it.
Great. Questions? Marshall?
Last year, the Air Force tried to do some moves and restructure, and they turned to the National Guard and the Reserve for reduction of airframes and personnel. Congress took an exception, and out of it came the National Commission on Air Force Modernization and Efficiency. What is your opinion on having independent commissions look at some of the problems facing DOD?
I think it's potentially useful, but they need to put really short suspenses on it, and because we don't want that stuff to drag on. This isn't something we could afford to have a debate about for 18, 24 months at a time. We've really got to do that in a way that's expeditious and gets the information out there. Hey, look, there are a lot of differing positions by honest, forthright people that are at odds with one another. How much of our force structure should be Guard and Reserve? How much should be active duty? How much should the airframes be in the Air Force side of it, vice the Navy side of it? There's a lot of debate that needs to occur, and I don't think we should shy away from doing it, but at the same time, there shouldn't be any sacred cows. We're in an unprecedented time in our nation's history militarily, and it's not a good one. I mean, on one hand, it's unprecedented because we got this incredibly capable force of young men and women, including the reserve component, that are at a training level and an equipment level today that's never been there before. But we're going to lose it quickly if we don't make the right decisions and make the right investments. So I think independent commissions can play a role, probably should play a role, because there's honest disagreement on a lot of these issues, and getting a different point would be helpful. I have to tell you, though, I've seen the results of a lot of independent commissions, and they get as deadlocked in politics and everything as anybody else. I remember being in grad school and having one of my professors tell me that when he had been on active duty, had been part of one of the many commissions to reduce the size of the Department of Defense. There's been like 5 of them since 1947. And every single one of them started the discussion with, our goal is to make the Department of Defense smaller, more efficient, lean and mean, all those words, and every single one of them at the end came out with a result was expanding the Department of Defense, making it more top-heavy and making it bigger and more expensive. It can't be common sense. It's got to be politics that drive you to that. And we need to fix that. And if that takes draconian measures, it takes draconian measures. But it needs to be done, but it needs to be done quickly. We can't drag it out forever and ever.
Christine?
You talked.
Hit the mic, yeah.
You addressed the issue of the chiefs being rolled, and that the most important thing right away, I mean, first thing is to give the chiefs a chance to speak, but we have a shift in leadership from Panetta to Hagel on the broader issue of a number of things. I mean, what can be done to basically give them cover, or to create the political consensus, or to create grassroots push? I mean, what can be done to give the chiefs a chance to speak and say what is needed? And will they say what you're saying?
That's always a toss-up, Christine. Truth be told, the chiefs are political appointees, right? Every 3-star and 4-star is a political appointee. They're a little different kind of political appointee than the guys in suits, but they're still political animals, and they are still, there's this constant debate in the United States of how much independence do those guys in uniform really have, how much should they exercise and speak out. I mean, General Amos did, and nobody fired him, thank goodness. But, we've seen other instances of military leaders doing things that are seemingly at odds with the administration, and they're not here anymore. So, I think Congress can make statements, can make offers to try and protect those guys. But, yeah, they're rolling the dice, though. There's no doubt. But you know what? I'm sorry. If you're a 4-star running a service, you got those stars for a reason, and part of it is so you can bet them when you want to do the right thing. I'm not saying that they don't have courage, but there needs to be an extraordinary amount of courage that is shown in those cases. And when it looks like there's retribution being dealt out to somebody like that, that is something that Congress can jump on with both feet and should start screaming bloody murder, because we want the best people in charge of our military, not the ones that just agree. And, you know, if that's the case, then Congress doesn't ever need to call on the chiefs. Just leave them back in the Pentagon, let them run things, and just talk to their civilian masters. Now, this is from a guy who, you know, Secretary Rumsfeld, this is a little tangent, he told the Congress and he told the White House, because they would say, well, we understand what you want, Mr. Secretary, but we want the chairman to come over to tell us what he wants. And he said, there's only one voice in the Pentagon, and I'll tell you what it is. And, you know, now at the same time, the chairman did go over and all the time with him and always spoke there. But he was making the point that the military is not separate from the civilians and never should be. But they do need to be able to give an honest assessment. And in some cases, that may mean them saying, this is wrong, I'm out of here. And you know what? I don't think that's going to hurt any of those guys. But it is a tough decision, and not one I've had to make. So I'm not going to pick on them individually. But at this point in our history, it's necessary.